If there's a place in the world whose politics have been distorted by the ideological mirrors of people that don't live there, it's Venezuela. Join me for a brief explainer so you can understand the basics of Venezuelan politics and understand why it's not as simple as screaming socialism or American imperialism. Venezuela was one of the first Spanish colonies to declare itself independent in 1810. Under the leadership of Simón Bolívar, it became part of a large confederation known as La Gran Colombia that also included modern Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama. Unfortunately for Venezuelans, there was a lot of disagreement between their leaders about how to govern themselves. Liberals and conservatives, federalists and anti-federalists disagreed on who and what should have power, how it should be divided, and what role the Catholic Church should play. This meant that even after seceding from the Gran Colombia, for most of the 19th century, Venezuela faced constant instability, coups, civil wars, localized rebellions, and a weak state that was incapable of providing public goods even when peace permitted it. Part of the problem was its geography. The lack of roads, the Andes Mountains, and difficult highland terrain made it difficult for anyone in charge of government to have the full monopoly of power, so caudillos dominated. This began to change under Juan Vicente Gómez, the de facto ruler of the country between 1908 and 1935. Venezuela had had national strongmen before, but Gómez had a significant advantage over his predecessors: oil. The new resource, discovered in Maracaibo in 1918, permitted the strongman to have enough money to bribe any potential challengers, create massive public works like roads that helped his own ends, crush the opposition, and have the side effect of improving the economic lot of the country, which also granted him legitimacy and power. Subsequent nationalists, like Hugo Chávez, would blame the existence of his regime on American imperialism preying on Venezuela. But that is not quite correct. It's true that Gómez was quite happy to grant concessions to American companies, and only a tiny elite benefited from the oil bonanza. But that was because that's what suited Gómez. Had there been no oil or American interest, Venezuela would have had a similar reality. The only difference would probably have been fewer public works and fewer rich families. We know that because that's exactly what it was like under the strongman for 10 years before American companies showed up. Even if he had been overthrown, there's no reason another caudillo wouldn't have followed in his footsteps. Gómez died in his bed, and authoritarianism continued after him. But his successors opened up some political space and legalized political parties, one of which, Acción Democrática, AD, led by Rómulo Betancourt, became an important counterweight. Disagreement over who would continue to lead Venezuela paved the way for a coup in 1945, which was carried out by an uneasy alliance between AD and some political factions led by Pérez Jiménez. This resulted in a new government, radical in its intent and execution, as Betancourt tried to destroy any remnants of Gómezismo, known by Venezuelans as El Trienio Adeco, or AD's 3 years. It was an ambitious government that permitted universal adult voting for the first time, bolstered unions, passed an agrarian reform, raised taxes on oil companies to benefit the country, and tried to use the oil bonanza more broadly. Most of all, though, it allowed for the first time the peaceful transfer of power from one president to another, as Venezuela had its first completely universal, free and fair elections in 1947, and Rómulo Gallegos replaced Betancourt without incident. This was all too much for AD's former military allies and for some opposition political parties. A coup followed, and only a few months after beginning his presidency, Gallegos was forced into exile. The military junta promised new elections, but instead it became increasingly authoritarian and from 1952 on became Pérez Jiménez's dictatorship. Staunchly anti-communist, he painted all opposition as such and proceeded to imprison, torture, or kill anyone who dared criticize his government, communist or not. He then used the oil revenue to create massive infrastructure programs, a similar approach to Gómez but in a much grander scale. His idea was to modernize Venezuela as quickly as possible. The country did benefit from this, but the brutality of the regime, the lack of democracy, and the massive inequality that persisted despite government spending made his government extremely unpopular. A massive strike was the beginning of the end, and he was forced to leave the country in 1958. So Venezuela had the chance to once again construct lasting democracy. But how would one do that exactly? It was not just the military that was the problem. The various political factions did not trust each other, and although AD was the biggest one, it was not large enough to govern on its own. The solution was a power-sharing agreement that came to be known as the Punto Fijo Pact. In it, the major political forces in the country, AD, COPE, or Social Christian Party, and URD, Democratic Republican Union, agreed they would recognize the election results. They also agreed to prevent the creation of single-party hegemony, to share power, and most importantly, to share oil wealth. In other words, this was a kind of parliamentary coalition government, except it would be permanent, and it would mean that whatever the voters would choose, members of the three parties would still have access to government resources. Poignantly, this agreement excluded the Communist Party, so everyone got what they wanted. The three major parties a guarantee of viability even if they lost, and the military the addressing of their concerns, that no party would have too much power, and that the communists would be entirely excluded from gaining power via elections. This might seem like a terrible idea, and it was, in the long run. But at the time, it had the intended effect. It eventually created a stable and peaceful country, although it still took a while. During the first presidency under the agreement, that of a repeat of Rómulo Betancourt, there were multiple insurgencies, assassination attempts, and failed coups. The problem was that the elite agreement, by definition, excluded the general public, and as time went on, the government became more and more impervious to public opinion, despite regular elections and a free press. But that was still in the future. Before things really turned ugly, Venezuela experienced its golden years. Depending how you measure, the golden years were roughly from the late 1950s, when the economy started a sustained level of growth, or the early 1970s, after the creation of OPEC and the dramatic rise of oil prices, to the 1980s, when oil prices crashed. At the time, Venezuela was the envy of Latin America, as it had its highest GDP per capita, the highest wages in the region, and a migration destination for many immigrants, including Europeans, who saw Venezuela as the place to improve their lives. Finally, oil seemed to be spread for the benefit of the population. Dependency on oil, however, meant that when oil prices crashed, inevitably the wheels would come off the bus that was the Venezuelan political economy. When faced with a sudden drop in revenue, governments have three realistic options to maintain macroeconomic stability. First option is to increase taxes. Second is austerity, that is, dramatic cuts to government spending. And third option is to borrow, basically an option to spread the pain over time. Trouble was that in the late 1980s, the country was in a double bind. Venezuela had already been borrowing money at an unwise rate, mostly because they thought that the good times would keep going. So why not have some of the money they would be getting tomorrow today? Turns out that using future oil prices as collateral was a terrible idea that came crashing down much faster than they thought. Thus, realistically, they only had two options: austerity or a tax increase, especially because, to the extent that they could borrow money, it would be from the IMF, whose neoliberal policies demanded austerity. Without good options, the Venezuelan government did what it had always done in the past: get the poor to pay the bill. Except at this time, it would hurt more than in the past. That was because the government had opted for large subsidies for transportation, oil prices, food prices, and so on during the golden years. And now people were not just used to them, but needed them more than ever, as the economy had slowed down. The result was El Caracazo, an event loosely translated as Caracas explodes, when in February 1989, a wave of protests, riots, and social unrest was met by the government with massive force, resulting in the deaths of around 300 people. The government wobbled and some of the reforms were watered down, but protests and tension continued. Into the breach stepped Hugo Chávez. His method was a common tactic in Venezuelan politics, a military coup. Two, actually. The first one was in February 1992, but it failed. Errors, defections, and unforeseen circumstances led to the Chávez forces in Caracas being cut off from other conspirators, so they were neutralized and captured. But the government made a crucial mistake. It asked Hugo Chávez to go on national television to tell the other forces, which had had more success, to put down their arms. Chávez did, and captivated the Venezuelan public. Here was this pardo, or non-white man, someone that looked like he truly belonged to the masses, fighting the much-hated president Carlos Andrés Pérez. But he also poignantly said, unfortunately, for now, the objectives that we set for ourselves have not been achieved in the capital. In other words, he was not just about to give up because he had failed. And he didn't. Even though he was imprisoned, he commanded a second attempt that tried to get him out of jail. This time, the rebels came much closer to succeeding. They took over one of the main TV channels in the country and broadcast a message that Chávez had made in jail, encouraging people to back the coup. The second attempt didn't succeed either, but it created lots of political instability. Soon after, Carlos Andrés Pérez was out, this time not because of extra-constitutional means, but over an impeachment as a result of misuse of public funds. His successor, Rafael Caldera, looking to pacify the still unhappy military sectors, then promised during the 1994 election that he would dismiss the legal charges against those who had participated in the two 1992 coup attempts, and did just that when he became president. Later, Hugo Chávez would say that they had had the audacity to create a revolutionary army inside the armed forces themselves because they were fed up with the corruption of the government. It was something that many Venezuelans agreed with, and the government in the years after 1992 did not do much to change their minds. In between, there was a banking crisis that began when the second largest bank in the country, Banco Latino, collapsed, which then morphed into a financial crisis that took down tens of thousands of small businesses. Inflation accelerated, and the government then expanded some of the policies that had brought about the Caracazo. Chávez, now free, blamed all of this on what he called the partidocracia, or rule by the parties. We have plenty of oil, he said, and if people are suffering, it's because of the corrupt political system that only thinks of itself. He was mostly right, and Venezuelans agreed. In 1998, when they had a chance to get rid of the old parties, they did. Hugo Chávez won the election by 16 points. His rule brought some seeming economic relief. Inflation tapered down, GDP began to grow again, and Chávez did not use the anti-capitalist rhetoric that he would use in later years. In fact, he even made it a point to go to the New York Stock Exchange to encourage people there to invest in Venezuela. What he did do, that began to alarm some sectors in Venezuela, was to systematically dismantle the institutional makeup of the previous regime. The most obvious way he did this was by using his power and popularity to call for a new constitution, which was promptly ratified and overwhelmingly supported by the public. This made sense. Chávez's entire political persona was based on the rejection of the previous system. Thus, the public did not see much danger in his call for new powers, and in the new constitution, he got them. Presidential terms were expanded, re-election was permitted, executive decree power was granted, the judiciary was remade, the president got the power to dissolve Congress. The fact that much of the opposition to the new project came from the elite and the government workers only proved to the public that Chávez was indeed fighting for the poor. This was especially so when in 2002, a US-backed coup nearly succeeded in ousting him. As Chávez regained control, he went after everyone that had shown any support for the coup, sometimes illegally. To his supporters, this was confirmation that he was a true warrior that would never let the old corruption come back. To the rest, it was more proof that Chávez was on his way to becoming a dictator, if he wasn't one already. Venezuela became increasingly polarized. Suddenly, every political aspect in the country revolved around the figure of Chávez, who in turn claimed to be doing everything as a disciple of Simón Bolívar. So what kind of record did he have? Well, he did dramatically curtail extreme poverty. GDP grew, the unemployment rate was more than halved after 2003. To the masses, it certainly seemed as though Chávez was delivering on his promises. The fact that some wealthier Venezuelans were leaving the country only made them even more certain of it. The problem was that much of it was buoyed not by Chávez's astute economic policies, but by Venezuela's old friend, rising oil prices. As they got higher and higher, the government's toughest decisions were how to spend the windfall. What he did not do is what Americans often think he did. He never abolished private property. He did not raise taxes over 50%. In fact, the tax rate for the richest person in Venezuela, even today, is 34%, lower than the United States' 37%. He did not ban Christianity. In reality, he often cited quotes from the Bible and called Jesus the greatest socialist in history. He didn't nationalize whole industries either. As it happens, Venezuela had nationalized the oil industry in the 1970s, long before he showed up on the scene. What he did were a number of expropriations, but usually with political rather than economic ends. In other words, Chávez never closed the economy entirely, as some of his critics imply, and he did have success in improving the lot of the poor, which was the stated goal of the comandante. The luck of the regime could not last for long, however, and the economy began to falter at the end of Chávez's life. In 2009, oil prices fell but quickly rebounded. The contraction of GDP that year was only a preview of much worse ahead. But before that could happen, Hugo Chávez got cancer. Before he died, he made sure to handpick a successor that would continue his project, Nicolas Maduro. Maduro was picked for no other reason than his absolute loyalty to Chávez. He lacked the charisma of Chávez, and soon he would also lack his most potent weapon, high oil prices. Within 2 years of his presidency, the cost of a barrel of crude had halved. Even worse, Chávez's legacy in PDVSA, the national oil company, had been to bring it completely under the control of the government, so he had replaced many of its members with loyalists, especially after the 2002 general strike. That brought fealty to Chavismo, but also a loss of expertise. As foreign investment dried up, Venezuela had the worst of both worlds. It produced less oil than in previous decades, and what it produced, it received far less for. Naturally, the government's revenue collapsed. Thus, after 30 years, Venezuela was right back to the years prior to the Caracazo, except with an economy even more dependent on oil. Faced with nearly the exact same awful choices that Carlos Andrés Pérez had, this time Maduro opted for none of them, but a much worse one: printing money. Most governments try to avoid this option because it can create hyperinflation, which is basically a tax on the poor that is very hard to control. But Maduro would have a much harder time choosing any of the other three options, given that it would go to the core of legitimacy of a pro-poor regime. Inflation would be stealthier. In any case, the government no doubt thought it would be temporary. Oil prices had bounced back before. They had done so only a few years earlier. Venezuela too had been experiencing double-digit inflation for decades. If inflation would go a bit higher, would Venezuelans blame the government for that? Maduro bet they wouldn't. The miscalculation was catastrophic because high oil prices did not return, and soon Venezuela was stuck in a bout of hyperinflation. 4 years later, the country was experiencing inflation of nearly 2 million%. Imagine what that does to a place. If 4 years earlier you had 1.5 million bolivares in the bank, after this, that money would be worth less than one. It means that anyone with a fixed salary would soon be making misery wages. People like pensioners, anyone earning a minimum wage, any type of government employee. It would also mean that anyone that had access to dollars could take advantage of the situation to become wealthier. The economic distortions were profound. This, more than anything, is what has caused the Venezuelan collapse. In 4 years, the country had lost over half its GDP. Millions of Venezuelans left, desperate to leave the catastrophe behind. Note then that the collapse did not come from socialism, but from authoritarianism. One of the reasons why Maduro was able to continue his catastrophic inflation policies was because there were no representative independent sources of power that could block the regime's decision-making. Meanwhile, the Chavista elite didn't have much of a problem with inflation because they did have access to dollars. For some, it was even an advantage. Naturally, Maduro's regime does not take responsibility for what happened. They blame the United States. In particular, they blame American sanctions. But that's nonsense. Obama imposed sanctions on individuals, something that could not have caused the inflation problem. Trump's sanctions have been far more damaging to the Venezuelan economy, and it no doubt has hurt Venezuelans, and not little to weaken the Maduro regime. But those sanctions were imposed on August 2017. By that time, the Bolivar was already on such a hyperinflationary path that it took about 10 minutes for a Bolivar to lose 90% of its value. Current Venezuelan politics, then, could be summed up as trying to figure out a way to bring back economic stability to the country. To the opposition, this means transitioning to a country with more counterweights and one where Maduro does not rule. To Maduro, this means staying in power, but without American sanctions and outside capitalization. In the meantime, inflation has receded from its peak, but Venezuelans continue to leave by the thousands every day. As of right now, it looks like for the foreseeable future, Chavismo is here to stay, but also the economic turmoil that has plagued the country.